next presenter. Give me a second. That would be our very own Tim Libretti. Hi, Tim.
Hey,
and Tim is ready.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Associate Provost, the College of Arts and Science. And we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kabai. It's kind of difficult to follow that and talk after that one, but thanks everyone for coming. I want to begin, I'll try and get through this quick so we can get caught up on some time, but I want to begin today looking at a quote from 1929 at a moment of intense nativism and racism in the United States, or another moment among many, as I think it provides some insight into a cultural logic of genocide that we talk less about in the United States, but I think which is very important for helping us understand in greater fullness sort of the operations of genocide. Now, in 1929, John Gould Fletcher wrote in a literary journal called The Criterion that was edited by the poet T.S. Eliot. He wrote, "It is impossible to grasp the reason for Marx's naive dismissal of man's finest achievements without first understanding his own peculiarly racial psychology. Marx was, as known, a Jew, and his greatest confusion of thought, that of the wage-earning class with the producing class, as well as his apocalyptic world revolution, are products of specifically Jewish psychology. If we study history closely, it is apparent that the Jews as an independent race were deeply despised by the Egyptians, the Babylonian Assyrians, the Romans, as since the dispersal they have remained on bad terms with various Christian communities in which they lived." Most brazen and sensational here, of course, is Fletcher's shameless and inflammatory anti-Semitism, and he dismisses Marx's formidable body of thought on the basis of his Jewish identity. While the anti-Semitism blares most loudly here, though also lurking in Fletcher's comments more quietly, is also a hatred and devaluation of the working class, or the wage-earning class, as he calls it. He dismisses Marx's valuation of the working class as the producing class, viewing it as a figment of the Jewish intellect he also devalues. This kind of thinking is precisely what underwrites and ratifies genocide. Jewish lives and working class lives, just like Black lives in America, matter less or not at all. They are disposable in the white male Christian supremacist universe. We tend, however, in our white supremacist worldview to focus less on the way our class segmented society, our class hierarchy and its attendant values enables genocide. While the Genocide Convention, the United Nations adopted in 1948, defined genocide in terms of particular, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Subsequent scholarship, and even Raphael Lemkin's scholarship previous to the convention, has debated which constituencies of people should qualify as a group, in addition to what constitutes genocide. These are all matters of debate, as you know. In the past, there have been arguments for inclusion of political groups. Some scholars have argued, as I'll discuss in a bit, that groups should be included on the basis of gender, that women, for example, constitute a group. Today, I want to step into these debates by arguing that the working class is a group that historically has suffered genocides, and in doing so, I want to take on the related question of what constitutes genocide, as well as, and mainly, how identifying the working class as a group that historically suffered genocide can provide us important insights into the social, political, and economic value systems that create the conditions of possibility for genocide, which obviously is crucial for us to understand how to pursue the prevention of genocide. In fact, I believe ignoring or excluding the working class as a group from the definition of genocide dangerously occludes our understanding of the dynamics and mechanisms of genocide, particularly when it comes to structures, values, and behaviors, which are largely normalized in our everyday lives, but nonetheless enable and potentially legitimate genocides. In particular, I will argue today that the value system operative in the US political economy, contemporarily and historically, which has powerful relays to our dominant moral value system, is one that, in assigning differential value to varieties of work necessarily assigns different value to the lives of people performing the work. Put another way, our political economy determines value makes some lives matter more than others. And we can look back through US economic and labor history and decipher the way US political economy and the way labor has been valued and organized really makes some lives matter more than others. And we should remember, I think, here that talk about race in America is often also talk about labor, or should entail talking about labor. The 1619 Project, we might keep in mind, focuses on the impact and legacy of slavery, a racist system of labor exploitation in US history. Before I jump into exploring the issues of genocide in US labor history and political economy, let me draw on another example that might help kind of clarify my approach in arguing that the working class ought to be considered a group within definitions of genocide, and that may also explain why, despite the fact that US history is punctuated with acts of murderous and organized violence against workers, these acts have not typically been characterized as genocide. They don't make the literature. In her 1985 study, Gendercide, The Implications of Sex Selection, Marianne Warren makes a compelling case connecting sexism to genocide. And she writes, as you can see, the fact is that sexism is often a matter of life and death for its female victims. Throughout recorded history, in virtually every patriarchal society, innumerable female human beings have been killed, starved, or otherwise abused as a result of the cultural devaluation. The neglect or abuse of females has often been severe enough to produce societies in which men greatly outnumber women. I use the term gendercide to refer to those wrongful forms of sexual discrimination. Warren's charges against a world blind to and accepting of sexist violence against women seem to mirror to me dominant social attitudes in some sense toward labor exploitation and murderous violence against workers, including everyday violence in the workplace. This may be because women are such a large group, they're not even seen as a particular group. They're half the population. And also because these values are so deeply ingrained in our world that this violence is simply a matter of course. This marginalization of people a matter of course. I would suggest we have a similar dynamic going on with the working class, and we have all kinds of ideologies that justify this. We very much justify that some people have much less than others, barely meet their needs, and we call this meritocracy. Right? We seem to have no problem often that, and justify that some people make much more than others. And I'll talk about the way we have arrived at this value system as sort of a damaging one. I want to give briefly just some examples of what I'm talking about. And for the sake of time, I can't fully draw them all out. They're going to be quick. And they're just a few of the examples that I could draw on throughout our history. After that, I'll try to draw some conclusions from this that I think help us understand genocide a bit. I did want to point to the fact that, again, Warren tries to answer this question, why people don't see sexism as a form of violence and genocide. And she simply argues that it's so the ignorance is widespread. And that to even sort of bring up this issue, as she writes this book, she says would strike most people as false and paranoid, but she sort of anticipates the skepticism that we even find among the well-educated. So as one example, I wanna draw our attention to take an example from a book called Devil in the White City, which you might know, written by Eric Larson. It's about the Columbia World's Fair in 1893. And the book focuses on Daniel Burnham, the architect in Chicago, and also a real life character named H.H. Holmes, who was kind of seen as the first serial killer or documented serial killer in the nation. And early on in this documentary that Larson writes, he's talking about the way skyscrapers are built in Chicago and what it takes to build them. And he says, well, Chicago had some pretty soft soil, which presented some challenges in building skyscrapers, and they had to resolve this problem. And he says there were two known ways to resolve the soil problem. build short and avoid the issue, or drive caissons down to bedrock. The latter technique required that workers excavate deep shafts, shore the walls, and pump each so full of air that the resulting high pressure held water at bay. And he goes on to explain that this process, they knew when they built the Brooklyn Bridge, would entail the death of a certain percentage of the workers. It was just a matter of course. So they know, as they say here at the end, right, where they have a casualty rate of over 20%, that to build these skyscrapers is going to entail a certain amount of death. And the way Larson tells this story, I think you see the way that this murder is really just sort of normalized and legitimated as part of the process of building civilization, which is often, in fact, how genocide is legitimated. Right? That's just part of building civilization. And we see here sort of the casualness and sort of normalcy that, as Larson tells this story, it's very much built in and could easily go unnoticed. And so I think, again, one way in which the killing of labor is normalized. Now I'm going to go through a bunch of examples and they might seem odd to you, but I promise to try and make an argument for the oddness when I get done. So many of you probably know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This killed 146 workers, mostly women and children, who died from smoke inhalation, fire, or from jumping from these buildings. Now, the exits and stairwell doors were locked in this case, and that's why these people died. They couldn't get out. This did finally lead to the formation, one of the key incidents that led to the formation of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This also happened very similar in 1991. Here's a headline. I remember this very well, reading this when I was in college. Chicken workers locked in a North Carolina factory, also killed in fire. We have the Ludlow Massacre of 1914 in the Colorado coal fields, where 1,200 striking workers over 8 days were fired upon by private militias with machine guns. John D. Rockefeller was widely blamed for orchestrating that massacre, and it was a key moment in the formation of the mine workers' unionization. In 2006, there was a major mine disaster in West Virginia. 13 miners were trapped in an explosion and 12 died. The Mine Safety and Health Administration had cited the mine over 200 times in 2005 for serious safety violations. That had been the biggest mine disaster since 1968 till this one, the Upper Branch Mine disaster in 2010, that had 31 miners killed in an explosion. The MSHA identified 369 safety violations that resulted in $10.8 million in fines. There were criminal liabilities after this of $200 million. There were some criminal charges that were enforced. One person faced a year in jail. Again, hardly considered genocide, a year in jail, $10.8 million, right, for lives lost. Now, this might seem odd to you. This happened during the pandemic. You may remember this headline. People betting on workers' lives, knowing they're going to, right, knowing they're putting them in dangerous situations that are life-threatening. So this might seem odd that I take massacres and what seem like accidents and put these all together. But I hope to show with these accidents that they're not accidents. They're complete neglect and devaluation of these people's lives. And they know that this is going to entail loss. Our state is involved in it in the sense that, right, they'll cite these violations, but there are only fines. There's no actual effort to protect the lives of these people. And it's cheaper for these companies to pay fines than actually protect lives. So why does this happen? So Nancy Eisenberg writes a book called White Trash, and she kind of focused on the white working class. We know the working class is obviously racially diverse, composed of different genders. But but I quote this from White Trash to show that people are identified on the basis of class. It is a sort of distinct group. And again, we frequently have this language within our culture, right, that defines people as disposable, as trash, as garbage. Again, I think many of you have studied genocide in some regard, and it's this kind of linguistic othering, this kind of dehumanization of people that precedes and enables this kind of killing. But also we have, again, with this, we live in a political economy that has a very distorted yet normalized mode for determining the value of work. We like to think that theorists of our political economy who endorse it like to think that we have values determined by an indifferent market. But we know that this is not true in the sense that value is always fought over. And I want to just suggest how distorted it is by looking at how Karl Marx really thought about value differently. A chief element of Marx's thought was to rethink value itself. And so I'm not going to go through these quotes, I'll explain them quickly. In a piece he wrote called Critique of the Gotha Program, he's trying to imagine kind of a post-capitalist world. And he says, well, as we decide what people deserve, right? Because that's what we do in our world, meritocracy. What do people deserve? And we decide some people don't deserve anything, basic needs, right? He says, well, you can't measure the value of someone's labor in isolation. It doesn't make any sense. That's what we seem to do. But I, for example, as a professor, can't do my job without the librarian, the groundskeepers, the facilities people, technology people, right? How could I possibly distinguish or separate the value of what I offer from the totality of labor? And that's kind of what Marx says. Well, that begins to flatten out value in a certain way. And say, well, how does Marx think about value? Well, here's one way he does that, that offers an alternative, and that I think a more humane set of values, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, right? We're not sitting here arriving at what you deserve. We're simply talking about your basic humanity and to what you are entitled on that basis for your survival. But yet the ways that we create differential value, right? And we know historically that women, people of color, right, even within a working class, multiracial working class, there are wage gaps, right? And when we differentially determine the value of people's work, we are simultaneously, because they're linked, the work that people do and the people who do it, right? We are deciding that some lives matter more than others. And this is largely endorsed in our world. And I don't think that we're gonna, and we saw this challenged briefly during the pandemic. We had this phrase, essential workers, where we came to recognize for a fleeting moment how dependent we are on those people whose work is typically degraded in our world. And for a minute, to call them essential workers highlighted the distortion of our value system, its upside down nature. And so, part of this talk is geared to get us to think, and the Black Lives Matter movement invited us to think, on what basis do we make some lives matter more than others? And obviously we can look to race, but even as we unpack race, it brings us into these, again, other elements. Labor is one element, and particularly look at the history of labor organization in the US, or the way labor's been organized. And again, think about, say, the 1619 Project. Slavery was a form of degrading human beings, and labor degradation on the whole is something that goes on, right, within our culture. We degrade people based on the labor that they do, or our society does. And so part of the kind of thrust of this talk is really to get us think about how we value lives, and to suggest that that's also linked to how we value labor, and that confronting genocidal logic the genocidal logics at work in our world demands that we confront the value system that devalues lives and labor. So it's a small point. I'm not sure that we talk about it that much. So I wanted to highlight this today. Now, I think that, this is Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and scholars really like to dismiss B and C, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting the group conditions of life calculated to bring about. Not all, but you will find in the scholarship an attitude that says, well, this trivializes genocide altogether. And I just like to disagree. I think, if we're really going to assess the damage that our cultural and social processes are doing to people, that our political economy does, we have to look at the processes that are damaging and undermining people's mental and physical lives altogether, especially if we're going to think about prevention, right? We just can't look at the eruptions of, the moments where we see eruptions of massacre. Those eruptions of massacre grow out of normalized processes and conditions that we've come to accept that we're not paying attention to. So here are a few conclusions. Looking at the working class as a victim group of genocide and what causes the devaluation of their lives helps us understand the preconditions that enable genocide. Valuing people's work differentially and erroneously tends to equate with valuing people's lives differentially, right? Just to elaborate a bit, if you have less of a wage, if you don't have benefits, if you have less access to healthcare, to nutritional food, to clean, safe environments and housing, right? Obviously, that's the way that within our system, your life is seen as less important. So a key in genocide studies, particularly the focus on prevention, is understanding a condition that gives rise to genocidal behavior. So let me venture here that it is worthwhile to understand the conditions that give rise to genocide, not as aberrations or sudden or momentary divergences from normative social and cultural values and structures, but as deeply embedded in them. I guess that's the last slide. So thank you for your attention, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Libretti. And let me make a correction. Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Yes, I said provost. And I want to appreciate you expanding this notion of mass atrocities to the United States. I do think that many times we do leave that out, that America has not only participated in mass atrocities historically, still right now. We've been charged with crimes against humanity. And so I really, really appreciate you bringing that to the forefront, how you're describing it, how it relates, and how in political spaces, America keeps their name out of it. And we commit those atrocities nationally and internationally. So I appreciate that. And so I just want to open it up. I think we have time, maybe one question, two questions. Anybody have any questions? And I love the notion of that whole, how we value lives and genocidal logic. So thank like that. So thank you so much.
Just want to very quickly add on that, just to make the dots connect, the dots. The way you emphasize the B and C parts of the genocide definition is Absolutely. So amazing for me. And I recommend this for everybody. Barbara Colorazo, her TED Talk is so amazing. She really says, there is a very short walk or a very short distance between schoolyard bullying to genocide. And the way it's connected is so amazing. And that will make us think how important it is to understand human behavior. And it just ties everything together with all the presentation and human behavior. So yeah, I'm not taking my time.
Thank you. I'm going to email you for that name.
At the same time, I think there is a legitimate concern when we begin to qualify all forms of violence as genocide. So, Tim, I'm coming to just the last part of your talk. So I'm really worried. There are, crimes against humanity. There are violence that every human being ought to condemn. But there is also genocide. So my concern is that when we begin to qualify all these forms of violence and as genocide, then genocide actually loses its impact, moral impact. So that's just my concern I'm thinking about.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot about that, and I'll just offer a quick thought, Chi. You know, one of the things that kind of brought me to study genocide, apart from other, you know, as Chi, you know, we're both.
I'm calling it right now. I think I found these.
Oh, okay. So
sorry.
I think, you know, Chi and cultural studies, obviously the paradigm these days is, you know, we grew up studying race, class, gender, post-colonialism. This term is much more powerful because it makes us think about the stakes of what is undermining our lives. And I would say, so I see value in having this conversation you're talking about. I'm not saying it's an easy one. I'm saying we have to decide what is and what isn't. But what it does do is it makes us look more closely at the everyday dynamics that are undermining life. And I would say too, you know, I do think in terms of looking at the UN Convention, you know, it really focuses on groups. So if people are being identified as a group and suffering violence on the basis of that group identity, that to me is a little bit different, I think, than saying all forms of violence, perhaps. So I think that's something when we see behaviors that impact specific groups of people, then you know, that may make us ask some questions. But you know, I don't think there's there's no easy answer, Chi, to your question. Then we kind of.
I just want to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to say a few comments. Mass murder and injustice doesn't need to be genocide to matter. It's what someone said. Yes, I have been very uneasy at these sessions because of the mission of US as a major center for genocide against indigenous people, African descended people. What is lynching? But genocide against African descended people are not talked about in these sessions. So again, I agree with Tim is saying, very important conversation to have, and the politics behind why America gets left out of that conversation when genocide happens in this country, in my opinion. I also see Samantha's hand, and maybe this is the last comment that we take.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Great. Yeah, you know, my thought or my contribution to these questions from the background, thinking about the legal definition versus, you know, sociological or social definitions of genocide, and what are the use of each, also, you know, the other crime categories in the Rome Statute, et cetera. I think what the participant said about it doesn't need to be genocide to matter is what I always, I feel, say over and over with students, with others, and that if we look at sort of the history of the convention and the legal definition, you know, there are politics behind that as well that have led to what's again in the legal definition that is, I think many scholars truly recognize not fully encompassing and not fully useful in a court of law, especially. And so I think also, you know, as Professor, as I said, if we break it down too much, you know, to any microaggression, any act of bullying could lead to genocide, we're leaving out a number of, you know, key factors, processes, ideology, and things like that. But at the same time, if we say if it's not genocide, it doesn't matter, you know, we're doing a disservice as well. So I think looking at, again, the scholarship and also sort of implementation of scholarship around what does it mean in a legal court, who gets left out, and how do we look at other, I mean, lots of work on social definitions of, you know, cultural genocide, of, you know, forced pregnancy, other things like that, that really apply here. And I'll do a quick pitch for my late mentor's new book, Showtime by Leanne Fuji, where she does talk a lot comparatively also about the US and crimes here. So it's a beautiful text and a tribute to a wonderful scholar. So thank you. I don't know if that complicated or helped, but I think that these are kind of the discussions that a lot of us are having in this field as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the discussions, and those comments were by Ona Wayne and Mama Barbara Scott. And there's others in there, so please read them about the political stuff around US and genocide, and yes, and talk about it.